We have a tremendous difficulty in our culture addressing, dealing with pain and death. We shuffle away seniors and those who are suffering into sterile environments, often admitting that we don't know how to care for someone in their final days. We find death incredibly awkward. We actually even mask bodies after death and embalm them in such a way as to try to preserve some sort of looking of life in the body that has no life left in it. We are awkward when we go into dental offices and doctor's offices and find the reality of pain and suffering incredibly difficult. We find both death and pain hard because we don't know how to deal with people who suffer greatly. And because we struggle to know how to deal with people who suffer greatly, and because we feel awkward around the subject of death, when it comes to that moment where we have to face the reality of someone we love dying, or we ourselves will face that moment unless the Lord would return to take us to be with him, when we have to face death, it is this incredibly awkward moment. What do you say? What do you do? How do I feel? And yet at the center of the Christian faith, at the very center, is a cross. It's a word that Roman citizens would not even utter on their mouths. They didn't want to talk about the cross. It was a word that they avoided because of how awful it was to see a crucifixion. Crucifixion was a normal, gory, awful practice that the Romans had perfected to use as a deterrent for any crime, to use as a deterrent for insurrection in the empire, to use to deter people from trying to do that which Rome did not want them to do. It was seen all along roadways as people would travel into major cities where there had been insurrections, bodies hanging on trees to display to the world, you do not mess with Rome's power. And yet, Christians put this symbol up on the front of their buildings. We wear it around our necks with necklaces. We have golden earrings that have crucifixes on them. As much as we don't like weakness and death, all around us as Christians, we actually embrace it. We actually take it and we celebrate this day, and we actually call a day that is remembered for the death, the gory death, the horrific death of the Son of God. We call this Good Friday. And in calling it Good Friday, we have to ask ourselves, how can we look at today and call it good? We have to look at Mark 15 today and see that the Bible story has been building to this moment. The entire Scripture moving, waiting, coming, culminating in this moment, so that in this moment, as we read in Mark 15, as the Gospel writers, each, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, as they recount this incident, as they spend an inordinate amount of time in their Gospels coming to this moment, that this is the center of the Christian faith. It is this moment for which Christianity exists. It is this moment for which all of God's purposes have been driving towards. And so we ask ourselves, how can we call this day good? And Mark tells us a couple things this morning that we need to see that make this day good. And the first thing that we need to understand is that what makes this day good is that we are called not to reject Jesus. All around Jesus in Mark 15 are various groups of people who reject him. We start in verse 1 with the Sanhedrin, this group of 70, these leaders who would gather together, and they made decisions about Jesus. And as they came, they had gathered and they had heard in Mark 14, verses 61 to 65, that Jesus had confessed that he was the Christ. And this was utter blasphemy. But realizing that they could not kill him for blasphemy, that they had lost this authority to Rome to do executions, The Sanhedrin had to find some way to get rid of this man who was a threat to the Jewish religious system. And so they had brought up the charge that he was an insurrectionist, a king of the Jews. And this charge would get Rome's hackles raised, because the minute that you say that Jesus is aiming for political power, it raises Rome's political might. And as a result of that, as hearing that Jesus had said that he was the very Son of God, there was a strong hatred among the Sanhedrin that they would mock and deride him, and that they had seen Jesus as a threat to the religious system. But we need to understand why they saw Jesus as a threat to the religious system. We need to first sympathize with the Sanhedrin before we criticize them. You see, for the Sanhedrin and the Pharisees and the Sadducees, there was a deep concern that Israel's history not be repeated. Israel's history had been a people who had lived in a kingdom. They had enjoyed the rule of God. They had enjoyed freedom. They had enjoyed life. They had enjoyed political freedom. And yet the people had disobeyed God and rebelled against him. And because they had worshipped other gods, they had worshipped idols, there had been many laws and rules around laws that had been created to protect the people from having happened what had gone on before. That when they had worshipped idols, they had been taken off into exile. And in order to avoid exile again, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the religious leaders had created systems of rules so that there would be no outward disobedience to the rules. And yet, over and over, what Jesus continued to expose was that while there were no idols in the land, there were idols in the heart. And the very idolatry that had led Israel into exile some 5, 6, 7 centuries before Jesus' time, it had not ended. This is why Jesus would say in John 15, verse 22 and following, "If I had not come and spoken to them, they would not have been guilty of sin, but now they have no excuse for their sin. Whoever hates me hates my Father also. If I had not done among them the works that no one else did, they would not be guilty of sin, but now they have seen and hated both me and my Father. But the word that is written in their law must be fulfilled. They hated me without a cause." And Jesus came to expose that idolatry is not merely the idolatry of an idol, a statue that is put on a stand and bowed down to and worshipped, but it is also the idols that are placed and embedded in the heart. And that he came to show that religious systems and religious ideologies and all sorts of things can be done. And these are a way to reject Jesus himself. It's a failure to appreciate that Jesus has come to end the exile, the very thing that the Pharisees wanted to avoid. You see, they couldn't kill Jesus for blasphemy, so they claimed that he was a political king so that they could protect themselves from going off into exile and protect their freedom. Not only was there the Sanhedrin who rejected Jesus, there was Pilate. Pilate, who hears the charges against Jesus, and as he brings him forward, Pilate is a shrewd man. He's a man who has wielded power, and he's got a heavy hand with authority. He's been known, and history has shown, that he would eliminate and kill anyone to preserve his own political power. And when he couldn't find the right balance as to what to do with Jesus, he had tried to find some way to find that he could keep his own political skin in the game and keep himself from Rome's eyes. Rome had watched Pilate be heavy-handed, and so Pilate had to maneuver things very carefully with Jesus so that he didn't raise the hackles of Rome and not get the Jews upset even more so with him. And so he found a way just to conveniently skirt the issues of who was Jesus. So he would offer the Jews an option. Would you choose Jesus, the son of Joseph, or would you choose Jesus, the son of the Father? That's what Barabbas means, the son of the Father. That Jesus, the son of Joseph, Jesus the Christ, the son of Joseph, there he was without guilt, without fault, without any blemish. And yet the people rejected him, and they called for his crucifixion, and they would gladly take the son of the Father, Jesus, the Son of the Father, Barabbas. And in this, it's not just the Sanhedrin and it's not just Pilate who rejects Jesus, it's the crowds that reject Jesus. And the crowds reject Jesus because he is not the Messiah that they wanted. He's not the political leader leading the convoy into Jerusalem to embed themselves in the city and bring about a new kind of freedom that they wanted. And because Jesus wasn't like that, they'd gladly get rid of him and get some other leader who would fit their cause. And they would take a gross misrepresentation of a Messiah, Jesus Barabbas, as their leader, instead of Jesus, the very Son of God. And they would take a man who would be lawless rather than a man who had been flawless. They would take a man who didn't fit, they would reject a man who didn't fit their expectations and take a man who grossly misrepresented everything that God had in store. It's not just the Sanhedrin who rejects Jesus because of the rules that are threatened. It's not just Pilate who is a people pleaser who keeps his power and rejects Jesus. The crowds reject Jesus because he doesn't fit their expectation. And finally, we see that the soldiers reject Jesus because they get into a mock mentality in that mob mentality. And as they bring Jesus before the soldiers, they spit on him and they slap a reed across his head and they beat him and they mock him and they bow down and pretend homage. And they do all these things as a display of their rejection of Jesus. And in all of these ways, these are the ways that people reject Jesus. He doesn't fit my expectations. He doesn't bring the kind of freedom that I want. He makes me feel uncomfortable and it forces me to deal with my people pleasing. Or just everybody else doesn't like Jesus, so I'm just going to go with the crowd. And for all those various reasons, people reject Jesus. Yet how does Jesus come? We're told that in verses 16 through 20 that Jesus is clothed and he's put this purple garment on him, and the soldiers wrap a crown of thorns, and they place it on his head. And what Jesus embraces in that moment is the very thing that you and I have had to deal with since Adam. For what had Adam been told in the Garden of Eden? That you'll labor and you'll plow the ground and that there'll be thorns and thistles that will make your work difficult. And now in this moment, the very Son of God is crowned with the very thing that cursed Adam. That's put on his head as his crown. That this is what he wears to show his kingship. It's not a crown of gold. It's a crown that marks the curse. The curse has been put on his head, and he displays to the world that he is the king. But the kind of king he is the kind of king who takes the curse of Adam and puts it on his head and says, I'll take it for you. And who has his hands nailed to a cross, nerves probably severed, bones split apart, feet pierced, back beaten to a rawness so that every breath, trying to grasp it, a breath on the cross would be excruciating pain. And he embraces all of the curse, every ounce of it, from the thorns of Adam to the beatings of humanity, to the insults, we're told, of all those around him, to show that he is the God who embraces the weak and the despised and the unloved and the sinful and the broken and the ones beaten down by the curse, because those are the ones who can come. So why would you reject a Messiah who says, you're welcome to come if you're one of those who has experienced the thorns and thistles and beatings and mockings and derision? So we don't reject Jesus. Rather, the second thing is that we want to receive his love. the love that Jesus has for his. And there is no greater display, we're told, of his love than how his disciples love him and how he loves his very own, even to the very end. First, we're told that Simon of Cyrene is walking along. He's probably a Jew from North Africa, probably a black Jew who's come from the diaspora, and he's there at Passover to celebrate. And how does he celebrate Passover? How does he begin celebrating the remembrance of the deliverance of the people of God? By being the one who is called to carry the very crossbeam of the cross. That he takes up the task of carrying the cross and following Jesus. And as he carries this cross, they would have gone along the Via Dolorosa, this road of suffering, and it would have been a long road. The Romans intended that from the point of the condemnation of a trial to the point of crucifixion, they would make you walk the longest distance possible so that you could be a public display to everyone who could see you. That they would display to everyone, this is what we do when you defy Rome. And as they crucify Jesus with the crown of thorns on his head, he's offered wine with myrrh, almost a drink to medicate, to numb the pain. And yet, what does Jesus do in the moment where he's offered the ability to numb his pain? He refuses it. He doesn't embrace something to numb his pain. Rather, he takes the full beating, the full scourging, all of the false accusations. He takes it all, and he is nailed and placed, we are told, between two robbers who do not stop the insults, but only heap insult upon injury. If it isn't enough that you've been beaten and scourged and mocked and publicly humiliated, falsely accused, now you're put between two robbers who heap condemnation on you. And the crowds walked by and said, you who could save the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, let's see you do that for yourself now. But Jesus doesn't revile in return. He never reviles in return. Instead of acting like how everyone else acts in the face of pain, Jesus shows us a very different way, that when he is pressed and squeezed and crushed, what comes out of him? I don't know about you, but when I'm pressed and squeezed and crushed, I know that my patience is short. My temper can get the better of me in a moment. That I can be curt and rude. That I can be selfish and self-absorbed. But when Jesus is pressed and crushed and squeezed, Luke tells us in Luke 23 verses 39 to 43, that there's a response that one of the criminals has because he hears over and over. While he has mocked Jesus, he has only heard Jesus say, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. Woman, your son. Son, your mother. I thirst. It's finished. Father, forgive them. They do not know what they do. They only hear, these two criminals only hear the pressing, crushing words that come out of Jesus, which are full of love and mercy. That's all that oozes out of him from the cross. That what oozes out of him from the cross is love and mercy, and it is the kind of love and mercy that causes one of the criminals who is hanging railed at him, saying, are you not the Christ? This is what Luke records for us in Luke 23:39. Save yourself and us. But the other rebuked him, saying, do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed justly, for we're receiving this due reward of our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong. And he said to Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And he said to him, truly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise. How does a heart change from mocking and reviling Jesus to saying, Jesus, remember me? It's when you see the love of Jesus, that when he's squeezed and crushed and pressed, that he does not revile in return. But that what flows out of his very heart is a heart of love. And that love can melt a heart of stone. It can change a heart that is resistant. It can cause the heart that hates God to love God. And so even in this moment, we see that Jesus, mocked and beaten, that those who have eyes to see and ears to hear can discover that there is a substitute waiting for them to take all of the wrath of sin and death for them, so that the guilty can be forgiven, that the unlovable can receive love, that the condemned can go free, that the guilty can be pardoned. And this is what it means then to receive the love of Jesus. That when we receive the love of Jesus, what does it look like? It's the last thing that Mark really paints for us, which is that when we receive the love of Jesus, what it means is that we believe by faith. In the last section of this passage, as Jesus takes all of the wrath, all of the scourgings, all of the insults, all of the injury, he cries out, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? He quotes Psalm 22, verse 1. He quotes this psalm and he cries out the cry of dereliction. He cries out with a way that the darkness covers the whole land. We're told from the 6th hour on, it was dark, and there's this sense of this localized judgment that just zeroes in right at the cross. That where the light of the world was, it was being extinguished so that the darkness of sin and death might be seen for how awful and ugly it is. As Amos 8, verse 9 would say, on that day declares the Lord God, I will make the sun go down at noon and darken the earth in broad daylight. I will turn your feasts into mourning and all your songs into lamentation. I will bring sackcloth on every waist, and I will make it like mourning for only a sun, and in the end, like a bitter day. And so here, the Son of God experiences this moment that Amos 8, verses 9 and 10 had foretold, a day of darkness, of doom, of dread, of condemnation. And that the one who did not deserve to have thorns piercing his scalp, he took Adam's thorns. He took Adam's rejection. He took Adam's fall, and he embraced it all. He took every ounce of all of the guilt and the shame and the pain, and all that he poured out was grace upon grace upon grace. And Luke tells us in these last few verses what Jesus accomplishes. That as he breathes out his last, that the first thing that happens is that the temple curtain is torn into two. This place that was inaccessible, this place where God would come and meet with humanity, this place, this localized place where only one man on one day a year could come to meet with God, now that curtain has been torn, as though God is saying, I'm free. I'm free from the condemnation of a system that even I had developed and created so that you would know that sinful humanity cannot come into my presence. Why? Because now I come to you. I've come to you. And I want you to believe by faith that you can come to me because I've come to you. That the gap that separated you and me, I've overcome it. I've dealt with that barrier. You feel that I'm far away? Oh, I'm closer than your very breath. And that by tearing the curtain in two, he has come and made a way so that you and I can be near because he has drawn near to us. But not only does the temple curtain tear apart so that we now have access into the very presence of God, but we're told that a Roman centurion, maybe even one who had been there pounding those nails, lifting that cross, mocking and deriding that very Jesus, now looks, and as Jesus breathes his last and gives up his spirit, this Roman centurion can say, truly, he was the Son of God. We despise weakness. We don't like suffering. We don't like death. And yet this, in the Christian message, is where we see the power and the victory and the might of God. That when we reject the broken, and when we reject confession, and when we reject the downcast and the hurting and the suffering, we miss the very presence and power of God. That God is most visibly displayed in his power and might in weakness. That God is most visibly displayed in his love in crucifixion. And for us to reject it would make this day a bad, bad, bad Friday. But when we, by faith, look upon a cross and we see that the one who loved us and gave himself up for us is the one who invites us to draw near, then we don't dare reject him. We receive his love and we embrace him by faith. And as we do so, we find that God's power in weakness is the most glorious place where we discover him and all of his love.